Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. Murder in Suburbia features the stories of more than 20 murder cases that have happened in the quiet streets of Australia's suburbs and small towns. These stories show that the most brutal and harrowing events can happen in any street or neighborhood. Featuring contemporary cases as well as some shocking historical murders, Murder in Suburbia proves you should never say it could never happen here. The book that we're featuring this evening is Murder in Suburbia-Disturbing Stories from Australia's Dark Heart, with my special guest all the way from Australia, Emily Webb, journalist and author Emily Webb. And if I could have helped out in that area, but we're on here now and we have the available time. I have all kinds of time here. We have the flexibility to go up to a couple hours, so we're going to have at least an hour if you can stay with us to be able to talk about this incredible book. Now, I had already introduced the book, and in terms of the little, very brief synopsis you have about the book, I want to just ask the question, if you could give our audience your personal background as a journalist and author, just how you came to your background to be able to have access to some of these stories before we get into the selection of stories for this book. And so tell us a little bit about your journalistic background for our audience, please.
No problem. I'm actually speaking to you from a little room at my workplace at the moment. I work for a newspaper group called Leader Community Newspapers, and that's the Melbourne local newspaper arm of News Corp Australia. So I've been doing this for about 6 years, but I've been a journalist for a lot of years. I think I did my cadetship in 1999 on various publications, magazines, and then I lived in London for a long time and did a bit of freelance and was a teacher for a while. But my husband, actually, I met my husband. He was a police officer in the City of London Police. So I've sort of got all these, little threads interweaving with crime. But for the past nearly 7 years, I have been working on various mastheads in Melbourne doing community news, so council meetings, court stories, all that stuff. But I've always been really interested in crime, and this book was inspired really by an unsolved murder 30 years ago. And the woman was murdered in sort of the general area where I now live, and she actually worked at the workplace I worked at 30 years ago. So I kind of started to dig a bit deep, doing a bit of an online, a multimedia project about unsolved crimes in Melbourne's Outer East, which is where I live. And, it stemmed from there.
Now, what I found fascinating is that, and I had said to the audience before we connected, is that there are, if I'm not correct, 28 murder stories in this entire book. Am I correct?
Yeah, there are. There was quite a lot, actually. I mean, some are longer than others. Some are historical, so I was going, on newspaper archives. But for several, I actually went and interviewed families, like victims, families, and police officers. Now,
you've chosen to focus on murders that happen in Australia's suburbia. And so we're talking about, we'll only be able to go through a few stories, but they'll really demonstrate how, like I said to the audience beforehand, is that incredible stories, incredible horrific nature of these murders that you've picked too. So this is incredible. So tell us about why you picked murders that would be in, again, the suburban area of Australia, but we're talking about one of these stories where there's 3,000 people. So tell us in America, a suburb is different than what we find in Canada, where we're in the middle of nowhere and there's not much of what you would call suburbia compared to America. So please explain what suburbia means and why you've decided to focus on suburbia in terms of all this collection of horrific stories and murders.
Sure thing. Well, I live in the suburbs. I grew up in the suburbs, and I've never been to Canada, but I think Australia and Canada shares a lot in common. So really, suburbs are, so I live in Melbourne, the city of Melbourne, which is we have states and territories in Australia. So Melbourne is the capital city of Victoria, and then within Melbourne you've got the suburban sprawl. So it's little suburbs, and it's from working class suburbs to more affluent suburbs. Some of the stories I did feature were probably more country towns. So we call, in Australia, we've got a lot of country towns, and obviously we have the outback. But suburbs, for me, I was fascinated because, I work for a community newspaper, group. I live in the suburbs. I'm raising my family in the suburbs. I grew up in the suburbs. And I think, it's sort of that bit of a cliche, behind the brick veneer house, there can be some of the most horrific things happening, and certainly in my research, you discover that is true.
Right. Now, we're not going to be able to cover all of these stories, but like I alluded to, that we will be able to discuss quite a few of these stories, and that will illustrate just kind of what kind of collection that we're dealing with here. Very varied. We're covering all aspects of murder, all kinds of murders and trials. So let's go with the very first story, because I think it's really sets the stage for what people can expect from this book, and that's the Burwood Triple Murders with Ashley Colston. So in July 1992, and with student teachers Anne Henstridge and Karen Smearden. So tell us about where these young ladies were. They were student teachers near a university. They had another roommate. So set the stage for us. Tell us where the Summit Road is, what kind of house they shared, what kind of relationship they had. And before we talk about the evening itself, just tell us what these ladies were like and their living arrangement. Tell us a little bit about Summit Road and the house that they all shared.
Sure. Well, this is a very notorious crime in Australian history. So this murder, Burwood is the suburb where these murders happened, and actually from where I'm sitting right now talking to you, Burwood's probably about 5 kilometres away. So Burwood is a very established Melbourne suburb, pretty nondescript, a lot of, brick veneer houses. There's a big university, Deakin University, which is where the girls were student teachers. So it's just a nondescript suburb, really. And Anne and Kieran were they were actually girls from the country, so they'd come up from a country town to come to Melbourne to study their teaching, and they were living in a house in Summit Road, which is again, nothing out of the ordinary about that road. And the third victim, Peter, he was actually one of the girls' brother-in-laws, and he was up visiting for the night. He had cause to be travelling to Melbourne, and he stayed overnight there. So that's basically setting the scene. So it was 1992. I remember this crime very well. I was still in high school in year 10. I think it was a massive news story, and still one of the most notorious crimes in Australian history.
Now, on this July 29th, 1992, these young girls, one of the girls was Karen, and so her mother was Jeanette, was down the street or very close by, and Karen was actually moving out of the flat, out of the house itself. They had advertised for another tenant to move in. Tell us about his mother. Her mother was down the street. She could have left that night to head back, but she decided to hang around. Tell us a little bit about this this scenario?
Sure. Well, basically, Karen was due to move back to her hometown of Hamilton the next day. So her mum was down staying with some friends down the road. So, she was going back. So Hamilton's a small country town. She was presumably going back to, maybe get a job in teaching. And so, they could have, I guess they could have gone home the night before, but the girls had been advertising for a roommate, and they, just wanted to get all that sorted before all that happened. So, obviously to share the rent and expenses. So basically it was the next day that, Karen's mother discovered the three young people dead in the house when she went to go and pick up Kieran. She was waiting for Kieran to meet her at the family friend's house in the same street, but when she didn't arrive, her mother went and looked, and, there was no answer when she knocked on the door. So she had to climb through a window, and she found the most unimaginable horror.
Now, what did she find inside? This is not a squeamish audience. This is, like you say, one of the most notorious crimes. What does she? What has been done to these people?
Well, basically, it's a shocking crime. They were shot. They were all shot in the head, and they were bound, their hands were tied with cable ties. Right. And they were executed, basically, cold-blooded execution. Right.
They were bound and they were gagged and they had bags over their heads and they were shot execution style, like you say.
Yeah.
Now, obviously the police are involved. But what do the police, when they look at the crime scene, what do they conclude, or can they make any conclusions from the crime scene itself? But what deductions do they make?
Well, basically, so the victimology, I guess, of Karen, Anne and Peter was that, well, there was no links to anything, dodgy. They were just, young people, clean living people. There was no reason to think they had any involvement with anything. So I guess they could have scrubbed, that kind of thing off. But when the police came into the house, there was nothing really stolen. Obvious, robbery was a motive. The police were really baffled. The three victims had no criminal records. There was a couple of $100 taken from the house, but the police didn't believe that was the primary motivation for the crime. It was almost like an afterthought. So basically, they were really stumped. They were struggling, and it was massive news. I mean, on the front pages of the papers, it was shocking.
Was there any evidence, or did they have any speculation that it might have had something to do with some kind of infatuation over one or both of the women?
Look, that was touted as, a theory, like possibly that, someone may have been, stalking one of the girls, but they really couldn't find any evidence of that down the track. But that certainly was a theory that was investigated.
Now, what was the reaction in the community, and what was the reaction, and how was it played in the media?
Well, it was front page news, as you can imagine. So the photos of the three victims were on the front page. People were scared because this was, the eastern suburbs are kind of pretty, and back in the 90s even, it was pretty sedate kind of, not really a rough suburb or anything, nothing to, indicate that you'd have any activity like that. It was just completely baffling, I think frightening, in that there seems to be no link, from what they could see between the killer and the victims. There was no reason why they were targeted. So it was, looking like the police's worst nightmare, which was a completely random attack. Well, yeah, a random attack really, but they had to work out how did it come to be that they were attacked.
Now, they had no leads, and how did they proceed? You speak in your book about 400 people being questioned, but is there any appeal to the public
there was lots of appeals to the public. There was a lot of press conferences. The families were completely devastated. I'm sort of trying to, so forgive me if I get a few things mixed up because it's a while since I researched it and wrote it, but I knew it was a crime that I absolutely knew when I wrote this book. I thought, right, I've got to write about this. And it has been written about before, but I think a new true crime audience wouldn't have known about it.
Right.
Basically, they were just, they were just going along trying to work out what was happening. But it was actually when there was an attack 5 weeks after the murders, there was an attack on a couple who were in a park in Melbourne, in central Melbourne in the city, and they were walking back to their car from a function they'd attended, and they were basically set upon by a man in a balaclava and was pointing a gun at them. And, they were trying to, get rid of this guy by offering him money. He grabbed the money, but what happened next was really, really frightening. He forced them from their car at gunpoint, and he directed them to a secluded area of the park, and he asked the woman to lie face down, and he started to take out some cable ties. So there's a link. This was one of the things that, was a link with the other murder.
Right.
And he started to bind her hands and the husband in a sort of active, I don't know what would go through your mind at this stage. He just decided to fight, He fight, and he sort of grabbed the offender, yelled at his wife to run, and she ran, and she happened to two security guards who were around in the gardens near there. There's some memorials, and there was a hospital at the time, and they were there, and she's screaming at them, he's got a gun, he's trying to shoot us. And so these security guards approached, and they were shot at. Actually, they survived, and they tackled this offender to the ground, and the police arrived, and basically that's where it went on from there. They started to discover, that they may have their offender for the Burwood triple killings 5 weeks before.
Yeah, with the heads up. Well, not the heads up. The security guard really doing a really brave and courageous job of subduing this guy. From Richard realizing that once this killer had, well, at least he believed that this assailant, once he had his wife, and you vividly describe this too, where he tells the woman to get on the ground. He even kicks her, even though she's complying. He puts the zip ties on, and then Richard says he believed at that moment that he was going to be killed, him and his wife. So then he saw that Colston put down the gun for a moment, and he leaped at his opportunity. And then eventually he ran as well with his wife. And then what was interesting, too, is that when police found him, he had an entire kit. And if you like, I can tell you what's in that kit. But
yeah, sure. Refresh my memory. I know it was a terrible kit. It's the kind of kit that would be your worst nightmare.
Well, what's really key to the evidence at trial, because they still have to have some really strong evidence, is that he had a homemade silencer made out of an oil filter. He had a knife. He had a balaclava. He had high voltage 22 caliber cartridges. He had handcuffs. He had thumb cuffs, zip ties, and really what cooked his goose was the ballistics matched. The bullets were matched, and but that's not the end of the story. So
no, it's quite an extraordinary story, really.
So this Colston, in your research, who is this Colston guy? Because you talk about that. He is not an unknown person, because in 1988 he was Captain Bathtub. Yeah, well, this is the really, really strange thing. Basically, so in 1988, so that was the year of Australia's bicentenary. It was a pretty big year.
He tried to sail across the Tasman to New Zealand in basically a little yacht. It was almost like a bathtub. And he attempted this quite extraordinary feat. I mean, he did pretty well, and he was featured in, the media. And he actually sailed the boat from Brisbane, which is up in Queensland, sort of further up, to New Zealand. And he was dubbed Captain Bathtub for his efforts. So it was quite bizarre. So this guy had no, on the face of it, he was okay. But the thing is, when you look a bit further back into his history, he actually was quite troubled from a very early age, and I've covered that in the book. He basically, when he was 14, which would have been in the early 1970s, he actually he lived in a small country town, and interestingly, my auntie grew up not far from there, and she actually knew the family. She said, did you know that I knew them? It was quite, because, small country town community. And so basically he went to a very small school, and there were 2 young teachers there, and he was stalking them, and he actually abducted both of them at gunpoint at age 14, and he forced them to drive from Victoria into New South Wales, which is, another state. So if you imagine Sydney is in New South Wales, and basically, he stopped to get some food at a roadhouse, as we call them. I'm not sure what you call them in Canada, but these women were screaming for help, and a truck driver rescued them. So basically, he got found guilty in court of certain things, but because he was a juvenile, he got 3 months at a boys' home. So look, I listen to your show a lot, and I know in Canada sentencing is probably very similar to Australia. It's not as hardcore as in America, but so basically he got released and kind of just moved back home, and I don't think rehabilitation was that good back then. So that on he went. So it's quite an extraordinary kind of background.
Now, we won't give the whole story away, but you would think that this, again, is a slam dunk in court. But as you say, Colston never says anything, and Colston pleads innocent at trial.
Yeah, he does. He does not say a word. So to this day, no one's the wiser as to why he did it. He is actually, I won't give it away. I mean, I can, he's one of our most notorious prisoners. He's never to be released. He's one of a small group of Victorian prisoners who are never to be released. But what I found he basically appealed. He appealed, and he kept appealing to the highest, the highest court. But finally, it's like, no, mate, you're away. You're never to be released. You're too dangerous to the community. One of the most frightening things that I found about this case was that police strongly believe that he actually randomly picked his victims from a wanted ad from the newspaper, because they found, there was an ad, and
right.
And a note by the phone when the girls had, been leaving notes for each other was like, a Duncan had called. Duncan called, he'll come around. So they believed that he posed as Duncan, who was interested in looking at the house, and they had followed up with some people before who had, visited the house, and really interestingly, there could have been more victims on that night, because there had been another person there quite soon. I think it was another prospective house tenant. So, I mean, there could have been four people killed, but I just found that completely terrifying that he lived quite a way away from this place too. He lived on a boat in a place called Hastings, and they actually could find in his street directory that he had actually mapped, sort of had marked certain pages. So they really believe that this was the best that they can estimate, is it was a thrill killing, which I just find completely terrifying.
What I found just coincidental, too, was that his first victims that he abducted when he was 14 were school teachers and were student teachers, and these were assistant school teachers. So they said, well, it was random. It was random, but at 14 he was abducting and stalking.
Yeah, well, this is the thing, and like they do actually think that quite possibly he may have, killed in between that time and the Burwood triple killings, because there is a rapist who has never been, and who actually ended up murdering someone who's never been caught, called the Balaclava rapist, who operated up in Queensland, and they do know that he lived up around there at the time. So yeah, I mean, you imagine that you don't just suddenly go from that at 14 to nothing until you're 38. I mean, there's got to be a bit of stuff in between.
Mhm. Yeah, he's a hard guy to figure, this one, for sure.
Yeah, and he's never said anything.
Now let's go to another story that's equally mind-blowing here. It's a suburban axe killer with Nathan Avent.
Yeah.
And he's, you know, what I found interesting about this, and I because it's in front of me right now, you've got to explain why he was considered a vulnerable teen, but he was 23. So let's talk about the situation that puts Nathan Avent in sort of the short hairs of the victims. So tell us about this background story, how he comes to be working around this home, around these victims.
Well, basically, so his father, his parents were quite involved in the Salvation Army, and so this happened in the western suburbs of Melbourne. And so basically, Nathan Avent was, he'd been doing some like handyman jobs for some of the properties that the Salvation Army owned around there, and both his parents were members of the church. He was kind of, a bit of an unusual character, a bit of a struggler. He lost his job. He worked at a local department store, Target, lost his job. Probably not one of life. Life doesn't sort of come easily to him, but he was doing some handyman work, and it ends up that that's how, under that guise, he came to be in contact with the victims.
No, the mother's 28, and she has a son named Stephen who's 10, and so tell us what's going on in their lives, and tell us a little bit about Stephen and his mother.
Well, Stephen and his mother were living in one of these properties, so, life's a bit of a struggle, They had the issues, I think, there'd been various issues with broken relationships and just vulnerabilities and poverty, so that is how they came to be living in, in one of those houses for the Salvation Army.
Mm-hmm.
So just a woman trying to do her best, like with her kids, life's sort of a bit tough, and just trying to get by on the single mother's pension, and she was sort of a bit of not a house mother, but it was a kind of a share house type situation, I think, with other people, and she was kind of a lead tenant, as it was described in newspaper articles.
Well, see, what I'm confused is that she's getting paid this 70, not very much money, but it helps out with, like you say, her meager income. She's getting $75 a week to take care of this Nathan Avent, but he's 23. I don't understand why he was, like I say in the book. You say he's talking about a vulnerable teen. Was he a vulnerable teen, and now he's an older person and now they know he's sort of a handyman? Is that how he? I don't understand how he comes to be at that age.
He didn't actually live with them. He didn't actually live with them, so he didn't really have much to do with them, except for the fact that he had done some sort of gardening work on the property before, because his parents were involved in the Salvation Army, and this house was owned by them. So the mother and Stephen really wouldn't have had that much to do with him, other than maybe seeing him around doing some sort of, odd jobs kind of thing. So, she wouldn't have had any reason to necessarily be worried about him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. So he comes to the house. What's going on in his life? Again, it never justifies anything, but what's going on in this guy's personal life that might be frustrating him at this particular time?
Well, he's young, and psychologist reports actually said he was, a very immature kind of young adult. He was married. He had a 19-year-old wife, and she was expecting a baby, and they were living with his parents. So, there's that issue of not having their own space. And I guess he just couldn't cope with the realities of responsibility, that were looming ahead of him. And he apparently liked to retreat into sort of, that much was made at the time of, he was watching violent videos, and he was just very immature. He wasn't equipped to really deal with life that well.
Well, what I found interesting is that you list the actual videos that he takes back, I think on this fateful day that day, and it's like drill killer, and then something about
cannibal apocalypse
cannibals
or something.
Yeah, cannibal apocalypse, and then a martial arts video. And I said, well, that's odd that they would specifically say those videos, but there's a good reason for that. So he drops off those videos, and that's that kind of stuff that he's consuming. His wife is 7 months pregnant, and he's frustrated, and he's living in the parents' home. But again, what's odd and doesn't work with this story is that he has, again, very similar to the Colston, he has a bag. He has sort of a kit, doesn't he?
He does. He's got a killing kit, essentially. And it's kind of, he's like, basically it's packed with ropes and, knives, gloves, and a tomahawk. And a tomahawk. Basically he goes there, and he has it in his mind that something's going to happen, and really it's what it. I didn't actually remember this case that much when it happened. I was still at school, but when I actually read, discovered a few things, and then I looked over court documents and old newspaper articles, and it was a major news story at the time.
Now, this trial's in 95, but before we get to that, before we get to this incredible crime with this 10-year-old Stephen, we'll remind people, and his 28-year-old mother, again, there's nothing to suspect this guy or not trust this guy whatsoever. So tell us how they get into the situation that the son is alone with him, and the mother is where?
Well, she'd sort of been in the bathroom. She'd been in the shower. So I think when she answered Stephen answered the door, and so our vent's there on the pretense that he needs to have a look at the backyard to do some work. And they're like, Stephen's 10 years old. I mean, he's got no real reason to think otherwise. And, he yelled up to his mum that, that someone was here, and she was actually in the, just finishing off in the shower. So basically, she came down and let him into the house, and she had no reason to suspect that he would be dangerous.
So she's in the shower. She doesn't know really what's going on with the son. What's the conversation? What goes on with the son and Nathan? What's the conversation? What's Stephen's reaction to him, and what are they doing?
Well, basically, Stephen's just watching telly, like he's sitting in the, in the lounge room, I presume. So this guy, Avent's gone out to look at the backyard and sort of see his pretend kind of survey of the backyard. And he comes back in and he sort of pretends, he said, I've got to call someone who's going to pick me up. I'm going to wait here. So the little boy's just sitting there, watching his telly, doing whatever he does. And the mum says, well, look, I've got to get ready. I've got to go get ready for work. So she just popped upstairs expecting that this guy would be getting picked up. And what happened next, is I'm sure you would just never expect it to happen.
And what does he do, this guy, with his tomahawk? Again, I've never read, in all the books I've ever read, this is a new one, a killer with a tomahawk.
It's well, basically, the little boy's got his back towards him, watching telly, and this Avent just suddenly takes the tomahawk out of his bag and strikes the child on the back of the neck, which, according to the coroner's reports, killed him instantly, mercifully. But you just can't even believe it. Like, it's horrific. And then
he hit him a bunch
he
more
moved
times.
on. Yeah, he did. I mean, the little boy would have been dead. And Then he sort of rinses the tomahawk under the tap, puts it back in his bag, then takes the hunting knife out and walks up to where the bathroom is, where the mum's in the shower, and he forces her out of the shower and is, about to, sexually assault her. She's desperate to know if her son's all right. And then suddenly this guy has a change of heart, as the judge remarked during the sentencing, and just was like, I can't do this. And he escaped. He basically tells her, your son's dead, in a sort of very unemotional way, and tells the woman to call the police, and then she just runs screaming out of the house. So it's a completely bizarre story. So the killer calls his mother and says, I've hit someone with an axe. And basically this was, this is the identity of Stephen. His mother was never fully revealed. They had to keep, in Australia, because his mother was a victim of a sexual assault, that means your identity is kept private, and also there was other children involved, so you've got to protect the identities, but obviously they're called Stephen by just called him Stephen. So it's pretty unbelievable.
Yeah, he brings this kill kit, he hits the kid over the head with the tomahawk, keeps going, then he's gonna rape her, and then he's gonna strangle her, and then he changes his mind. And then he calls his mother, but he's very remorseful in this. He's crying, isn't he? When he calls his mother, he's crying. He's like a child, and very immature. I think it displays just a complete lack of awareness and maturity. But what I've been baffled by, when I research crime, is some of these crimes, it was people who necessarily would have had no violent episodes leading up to an extremely violent murder. That's what I'm intrigued by. Yeah. Now, this trial was video televised, which again, being from Canada, this is an unusual. I think we've just passed a law that I think appeals might be televised, but we are very against, for our own reasons, I would imagine, that have been debated, not to televise court cases. And not every state does that in the U.S. either, but there have been some famous cases that I think for the true crime fan, thankfully they have been televised. So tell us why this one was televised, and was that controversial? This is 1995 when the trial happened, so tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was very controversial, and basically all that was televised was videotape footage that was made available for the TV news networks of the judge's sentencing remarks. So it was only focused on the judge. Look, it was a really major news story. So it was just one camera was used to record the sentence. So you're not going to get an O.J. Simpson style televised treatment, and that doesn't happen in Australia. We don't have that kind of coverage of crime. So basically, the Premier at the time and the Federal Attorney of Australia were quite critical of, the judges, allowing of this to happen. They likened it to being, saying justice is an entertainment. And I know you, coming from Canada, you'd know this, because I think we're very similar, definitely. We are a lot more reserved in our reporting of crime than, say, in America. I'm always completely amazed the stuff that can be said before a trial or during a trial in America. It's just we would be done for contempt of court in Australia if we even tried to do any of that. So it's got to be absolutely straight down the line reporting. It's very strict. So, it's definitely, but it was it was a shocking case, and it was it was a legal it was, it had never been done before, showing a sentence on television.
Now, this was a controversial trial too, because again, in a lot of places, remorse after the fact like this is not taken as serious, but this guy was believed in terms of his remorse, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, the psychiatrist reports, they basically felt that he would have a reasonable chance at rehabilitation, after, if he served his sentence out. So basically, it wasn't a case of this guy's never going to be released. It was like he was given a sentence of non-parole period of 21 years.
Now, what you say in your book, too, and again, it's a little bit shocking, but he was quietly released in 2012 in a minimum amount of time, wasn't he?
Yeah, so basically I think he served about minimum of 18 years. But so he was released 2 years ago. So, very quietly. I was able to get that information from the Adult Parole Board. So he's living somewhere out there. I mean, I think people who live near him know that he is who he is. But I guess,
right.
What can you do, really, if he's not bothering anyone, I suppose? But, he has been released. And I mean, I can't imagine that would ever happen in the US. If that was a similar crime, I don't think you'd ever get out.
Well, in some cases, but in most cases, I don't think so. And in Canada, we're more apt to let a person out after about 23 to 25.
Yeah, sounds similar to Australia.
But we have got more harsh in terms of now we actually have consecutive sentencing for serious crime like murder, up to 75 years before a person is eligible for parole.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that sounds quite strict.
It is. It's historically strict for Canada, I would say. So. Now, one of the other stories I wanted to cover in this short period of time that I have you here is Murder in a Small Town, the Rowe Family Massacre. This is an incredible case, and I can't even imagine the impact on Kapunda, which is population 3,000. So we're talking about, again, very, very small town anywhere, really.
Yeah.
So tell us
it's a
about
small,
Kapunda. So tell us a little bit about Kapunda, this little place, and introduce this, again, very much like Colston had this reputation previously. We have another reason why this Kapunda is on the map, and that people in Australia and other people in the world know this little town. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, basically, so Kapunda's a small town in South Australia, so that's one of our other states. It's quite a big state, actually. So you've got, the very famous wine-growing region, the Barossa Valley, and you've got outback South Australia. So, I don't know if you know much about Australia, but we've got a lot of different landscapes. So Kapunda is small. It's got about 3,000 people. But, up until 2010, which is when this crime happened, it had actually had a bit of a reputation as the most haunted town in Australia. I mean, that was based on a television series doing that, but it had, a reformatory, which was for, like, wayward girls back in the early 1900s, and basically ghost hunters and enthusiasts and kind of weirdos would come, to go and investigate the ruins of that reformatory. So basically, I don't think the locals really liked that tag too much. But then in 2010, this crime made world headlines, and it is certainly, definitely one of the worst in recent years in Australia. So I'll tell you a bit about it. Do you want me to?
Yes, you talk about 16-year-old Chantel Rowe and her parents, Rose and Andrew.
Basically, so they're locals. They live in the town. Andrew, is a co-owner in like a carpet cleaning business. Chantel is 16. She goes to school. They moved to the town a few years before. There's an older brother who now lives, away from home, in the same town, but with his fiancée. And, just a regular family. And it was basically when Mr. Rowe didn't turn up for work, his business partner went around to their house. And, if you see photos of the house, it's a very neat lovely little weatherboard house with a white picket fence and roses on it. And he basically looks through the window and sees the body of his business partner, Andrew, and his wife. And he's, obviously in absolute shock. And he rings the police, and that actually became what happened was one of the largest homicide investigations in South Australian history. So basically they set about trying to solve who did this. It was a police who went into the scene described it as a bloodbath. There was blood everywhere. The three of them had been stabbed frenetically to death.
Now, these bodies were found in different areas of the home. Am I not correct?
Yeah, so Chantal was found in her room, and I believe she was the last victim. I think the parents were found, in the hallway. They'd obviously been woken up by someone in the house, and they'd sort of got up to see what was going on. And I imagine you're quite, I know what I'm like in the middle of the night. It takes me a few seconds to get my bearings, and basically they were fighting for their lives.
Now,
against this, a literally knife-wielding maniac.
Now, did the police believe that there was only one killer or killers? Did they have any idea? And you talk about a bloodbath. We're talking incredible amount of blood. So this is savage overkill, wasn't it?
Yeah. So at first they weren't sure what was happening. Was it, a murder-suicide? Was it more than one offender? But basically the police described it as being there were more than 1,000 bloodstain patterns. So you can imagine for the forensic investigation that would have been really, really tricky to do. It was in every room, on every wall. They had fought for their lives. So basically they had to start. They believed that from their preliminary investigation that Chantal was the daughter, was probably the catalyst for it. So they needed to start interviewing everyone who knew Chantal. And so, just going up and down the street, chasing up tips from the public, and then, just working out why this happened.
And what was their break in terms of a lead that led to a viable suspect? Well,
basically, they were interviewing, lots of Chantal's friends, and this name kept coming up. A guy called Jason Downey, and I'm trying to work out, I can't remember exactly, he was 18 at the time. He was a friend of Chantal's boyfriend. She had a boyfriend. So, hanging around the group. And Jason had actually emigrated to South Australia from Scotland. So he was kind of, an outsider. He was a weedy, kind of very tall, very skinny kind of guy, a bit of a loner, someone who sort of was kind of desperate a bit to make friends. And so his name sort of kept coming up a bit, as he was friends with Chantal and Dylan. But what was interesting is, and I think when you hear police talk, they say often it's what suspects are insistent on mentioning in an interview, that sort of gives things away. So during the interview, Downey kept saying, well, Chantal's not my girlfriend. He kept mentioning it, and they hadn't even really initiated the discussion that they were anything but friends. So I think that a good investigator is going to their ears are going to prick up to that. So, they were DNA testing all the guys who had been at a party a few nights before. At the boyfriend of Chantal's, and so they just started to have a bit of an extra look at this Jason Downey. He was an apprentice mechanic at the time. But it was actually some information from his work colleagues that sort of started to give them a bit more of an idea that he may have had some involvement. He turned up at work, on the morning that the bodies had been found, but he was late to work and he had cuts on his hands. He said they were from a motorcycle accident. He did give the police a DNA sample, but he sort of kept weaving this story that he had fallen from his bicycle. Then it was because he'd fallen off his motorcycle, and then they were asking, well, were you at the house that night? And he's like, no, but I was outside the house. And, it just all became, obviously for the severity of the crime, he wasn't a particularly sophisticated kind of offender.
Right.
They found the real clincher was they found a palm print in Chantal's bedroom, like on the door, that actually belonged to him. So they're like, well, how did it get there if you weren't in the house? Explain that to us. So they were edging towards, nailing him down for it, but obviously it was a massive, massive investigation. They had to make sure they had everything right before they charged him.
It really tells the story, and if you listen to this program, or people that listen to this program know that often it's the really savvy work by detectives when they do have a suspect in their sights, then to be able to do the things and ask the questions and be able to have these people try to answer the questions that lead them into talking too much and saying things that they shouldn't say, which then lead that investigator into being able to finally crack this guy. How long are we talking about in terms of questioning to finally get this guy to crack this guy?
Now I'll have to quickly scan through the book because I can't remember. You might actually, just read it recently.
Well,
so
I just know that it's days anyway.
Yeah, it's days. So basically, the 8th of November, the murders happened. And basically on the 16th of November, so about a week later, he voluntarily attended the police station, Downey. He was escorted by a colleague. So basically they got him down there to say, look, we need you to sign a statement, mate. Other people have done it. And it was decided that was the best way to get him down there. So actually there is video footage that was released on the news after the court case that showed him actually attending the police station, and he kind of looks not that nervous. He's got, his cap on, he's got his sunnies on, he pushes sunnies up on his head and he shakes the hands with the detectives who greet him at the door. And there was a bit of light-hearted banter apparently in the car, like his colleagues were joking, oh, you're going to get locked up, mate, when you go down to the police station. They didn't know that he was a prime suspect for that murder because people were really scared that there was a complete maniac on the loose and there were going to be more murders. So, but yeah, he was basically arrested pretty much soon after that. So it was about a week, 8 days or so.
Now, what was the most unusual part of his trial, would you say?
Well, I think the fact was that he had absolutely no prior convictions for anything. Like no history of violent behaviour. But it's quite a leap, isn't it, from nothing to that kind of crime. So I think that's basically what was quite baffling. But he did plead guilty, but he kept telling his mum and his brother that he was innocent, So they basically had to, they just had to make sure that they could confirm that his plea was guilty just to avoid him being able to, appeal on a technicality or something like that. Right. He'd made up stories telling his brothers that the real killer was dressed in dark clothing and he saw him loitering in the area. But, yeah, I mean, I think that he's got a long time in jail to sort of think about what he did now.
Yeah.
He will eventually get released. He got some parole, but, yeah, he'll be in his 50s before he can be released.
Wow. Well, yeah, that is shocking to some people, I guess, especially in America where some of these perpetrators would never, ever get out whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, I think he got the top as much as he could, which is 30 years, I think. Yeah, 35 years non-parole. So that's a big sentence in Australia. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, we don't have that much time left. Maybe you can just briefly just describe just a couple stories that are, well, I mean, we only touched on 3 or 4 stories, so just tell us just the variety of just kinds of stories that you have in this book before I let you go.
Sure. Well, there's some unsolved crimes. One in particular is the unsolved stabbing murder of a woman in Melbourne called Nanette Ellis, and they just police announced a $500,000 reward for information for that crime. this year on the 30th anniversary. I spent a lot of time in the homicide detective talking about that, so that's in the book. There's some older cases. There's some quite shocking child murders in the 1970s in Sydney that I've detailed. There was a particularly bad run of that in the 70s. There's some sort of more historic ones from like as far back as the 1930s. I really enjoy researching newspaper archives, so I found some really interesting stories there. And there's also a terrible, terrible case in Perth in Western Australia, a little girl who had gone off. She was shopping with her family, and she just went off to go to the bathroom. You know, she's 8, she's going to the bathroom, and a 21-year-old who worked at the shopping mall, I guess you'd call it, he followed her into the disabled toilet, or pushed her into the toilet, and was trying to sexually assault her and actually killed her. And that's probably one of the worst, because he had been from England, and he had prior attempts at doing that. And actually there was a big rumour at the time that he was one of Jamie Bulger's killers who'd been given a new identity in Australia. Oh. That's not true, but that circulated. So if you read the case, it's the little girl's called Sophia. There was a rumour spread around the world that he was actually, in fact, one of Jamie Bulger's killers who had, been given a new identity and come to Australia. But that isn't true.
Wow. Well. Yes, you've picked an incredible collection of stories, Emily. It's shocking, and that's what people tune in to this program for. And it was some fascinating stories. It's amazing. What I had said to the audience first is that I guess you've got this skill from working in newspaper, is that these stories are very, very concise, very, very concise. They're not really short stories. They're just very well written, concise, and crammed in there with incredible stuff. So,
thank you. I guess that's when you have to write for newspapers. You sort of get used to, being conservative with your words.
Yes, absolutely. And it's again, I love the 400, 500-page book, but this is a real treat when you get introduction to so many wild stories, but then you're not missing out by having a short story. This is very, very concise stuff. So.
That's lovely feedback. Thank you. That's helpful feedback for me. Thank you for that.
And you've picked out some just great, fascinating stories that introduce true crime readers. If they haven't read about Australian crimes, they're going to be reading about Australian crimes now. So I want to thank you very much to come and talk about murder in suburbia.
Thank you. Sorry about the late call-in. It was just a nightmare I couldn't work out that Wi-Fi was down. So I hope people can, hang in and listen. I'm sorry. I'm sure that they will, and I'll absolutely they'll enjoy this interview. Taking in again some crimes from the suburban Australia, and it's very nice talking to you from Australia. And so, thank you very much for calling into the program and being part of this. I want to thank you very much. Disturbing stories from Australia's dark heart. You can say that again. Thank you very much, Emily Webb. And hope to talk to you again soon. Have a great night. Thanks, Dan. Well, I've got a new book coming out in January, so hopefully we can speak again.
Absolutely. Sounds good. We'll have to make a date. You have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.